everyone, I'm Rebecca and welcome back to my channel. Back in February, I started a new series called How I Made, where I talk about how I made some of my older costumes, ones that were made before I started my YouTube channel back in January of 2020. And then March got in the way with all of its fun Gilded Age and Bridgerton related content, and I didn't have time to do a second video in the series, so this is that slightly belated second video. Anyway, it has come to my attention that a lot of people have recently been making or are soon planning to make McCalls 7988, which is the 1840s style dress that Angela Clayton did for McCalls. So I figured I would take today's video to tell you how I made my version, since I made many significant alterations from the initial pattern. First though, a little about this pattern. I know we don't tend to think of short sleeves for day wear in the Victorian era, but when this pattern was first released, I did a bit of research and found that it was actually a thing, though it tended to be a style worn by younger women or teenagers. And in fact, there are many examples of dresses just like this, with yoked necks, gathered bodices, and short ruffled sleeves. So I decided to run with it. And in fact, I ran with it so fast that I actually had to order the pattern directly from McCalls, as I was making it in a mega crunch before Costume College 2019, and the pattern had not yet arrived in local stores. But I had this blue textured silk taffeta in my stash, which I had gotten for a steal from Fabric Mart Fabrics. And when I saw the pattern envelope with a very similar looking fabric, I knew that this dress was what I needed to make with that fabric. I do want to say that along with so many other of the Big Four patterns, and particularly when it comes to the Angela Clayton for McCalls patterns, this is not a very size-inclusive pattern. It goes up to a size 22, which, according to their size chart, is a 37-inch waist and a 44-inch bust. In other words, a few inches smaller than my measurements. So I knew, like with pretty much all commercial patterns, that I'd have to size it up in order for it to fit me. This was very much a quick project for me. I ordered the pattern from McCalls on July 3rd, and I believe it arrived on July 11th, 13 days before I left for Costume College. And amazingly enough, I believe that I had the entire project finished by July 20th, even though I was also working on a whole slew of other Costume College crunch projects at the time. So let's talk about the myriad of ways that I wound up deviating from the McCalls pattern. First off, I do have to say that despite the limited size range of this pattern, it really has quite a lot of ease built into it too, which of course is totally unnecessary for basically any historical costuming pattern. The pattern actually has enough ease in it that although I originally added additional width to the pattern to get to my normal pattern size, I wound up taking most of that width off. Also, I found that the side front seam needed a lot more of a curve for my bust size than what was given in the pattern pieces, and I don't have a particularly large bust. While I was fitting the mock-up, I also decided to shorten the yoke piece and to lengthen the lower part of the bodice front to better match the extents and daguerreotypes that I had seen. Another oddity about this pattern that seems to have no basis in actual 1840s bodices is that it has no side seam. In other words, the side front and side back are cut in the same connected piece, and if I were to make this again, I would make them into two separate pieces, as that will allow for a much more precise fit and make fitting in general an easier process. A second thing that I did not do, but in hindsight I really should have, is that I should have dropped the shoulder seam farther down the shoulder. 1840s shoulder seams sat incredibly far off the shoulder, and this pattern has a much higher seam than an actual 1840s bodice would have had. However, I forgot to fix this in the mock-up stage, so I'd already cut and assembled the silk before I remembered that this needed to happen. Luckily, commercial patterns do tend to be cut with extremely wide shoulders anyway, so while it's not nearly as wide set as it should be, it's at least wider than your normal shoulder seam would be in other decades of the Victorian era. Now, let's talk about the things that I did actually change. First off, the pattern calls for boning in the center front of the bodice, and that is absolutely silly. Don't put boning there. If you do, and I did try it at first, it will wind up poking up above the apex of the bust and actually pull the bodice away from your body. It is such a ridiculous thing to do. The other ridiculous thing is how the sleeves are patterned. It actually calls for 2 base sleeves, like fitted parts of the sleeves, one shorter than the other, each one with their own ruffle, instead of just putting both ruffles on one sleeve. The sleeve patterns are also a very weird shape that did not fit nicely in the arm's eye, so I wound up just changing the pattern shape entirely. I also decreased the size of the ruffles. I know that Angela based this one off of the orange dress in the Met's collection, but that is the only one that I could find with such huge ruffles. Most of the dresses of this style have 1 to 2 much narrower ruffles. So in other words, I wound up just completely making a different sleeve than the one in the pattern. The last main thing that I changed is that the pattern calls for the bodice to be bag-lined instead of flat-lined. I have no idea why, since this was never a thing in the Victorian era for any bodices. They were all flat-lined, so that's what I wound up doing as well. I flat-lined all of my pieces with Supima cotton. In the case of the shirred center front, you prep the shirring first, and then once your gathering stitches are pulled up, you flatline it to that inner layer. I'm surprised that the pattern did not call for these gathering stitches to then be stitched down to the flat lining layer, and in hindsight, I probably should have done that and may still do that, as it helps the shirring to stay in place and helps to prevent it from puffing away from the flat lining. I guess the fact that there was supposed to be the boning in the lining piece would have hindered those being stitched down, but since I wound up omitting the boning, those reinforcement stitches are something that I could still add in the future. One of the things that I did love about this pattern, though, was the prolific use of piping. If you know me, you know that I love finishing things with piping, and this pattern actually calls for piping in the side back seams, the back shoulder seams, the yoke seam, and around the waist, the arm's eyes, and the upper sleeve ruffle. Though it does have you do the very odd thing of applying the arm side piping to the sleeve side as opposed to the bodice side, which makes 0 sense to me, so I did not do that. I also finished my sleeve base with piping at the hem, since although the hem would have been hidden by the huge ruffles in the pattern, my sleeve base is longer than the ruffles, and so it needed a little something extra. I also trimmed my sleeve hems with vintage lace from my stash, as well as the neckline. I ignored the skirt construction that the pattern calls for completely, although like the pattern, my skirt is constructed of straight panels. My skirt is made of 3 53-inch wide panels, and each panel is flat-lined with cotton organdy. I cartridge pleated my skirt directly onto the bodice with 1/4-inch cartridge pleats, whereas the pattern tells you to gather the skirt tops and attach them to a waistband stay, and then attach that waistband stay into the bodice. Since mine is cartridge pleated, it is hand sewn to the inside of the piped edge of the bodice, which creates a lovely finish. The hem of the skirt has been turned up twice and is about 1.5 inches deep. The back of the dress closes with hooks and bars, which is also what the pattern calls for. I wear my dress over a corded petticoat and a 3-tiered ruffled petticoat, both of which are heavily starched, and my 1860s style corset. I wear the 1860s style one as I don't have an 1840s one, and an 1860s one is much closer in shape to the 1840s compared to a longline Regency or 1830s corset, which would have been my other option. Because this style of dress tended to be worn by younger women, when I wore this to costume college, I decided to style my hair in a rather youthful 1840s style with big ringlet curls and hair bows on the sides. I also paired it with some open knit black fingerless gloves, a long jet beaded double strand necklace, and a long gothic looking pendant necklace, all of which seem to be rather popular accessories for dresses like this, based on those daguerreotypes of the women wearing them that I found. However, I have since also worn this dress a few other times, in rather different ways. In early November of 2019, I hosted our first spooky shoot for the Puget Sound Historical Costumers Guild and needed something vaguely gothic to wear. But it was also November and cold, so the morning of the shoot, I decided to make long sleeve extensions that could be sewn into the short sleeves. These were semi-rectangular pieces of the silk fabric flat-lined with muslin, which tapered into the wrist, and then the wrist edge was just turned up into a narrow hem. The top of the sleeve edge is just finished with serging, as this is then whip-stitched into the base of the ruffled sleeve. Naturally though, I made these way too tight and was really quite uncomfortable for the shoot. So in December of 2019, when I decided that this was the dress I was going to wear to Dickens Fair down in the Bay Area, I undid the long sleeve seams and at first tried to get away with just having a tiny 1/4 inch seam allowance. But no, they were really tight. So I actually wound up putting a gusset in my sleeves, which tapered out to nothing about 4 inches above the wrist, and then tapered down to about 1/2 inch by the time it met the upper sleeve. But it actually added 1¼ inches of width through the elbow. At this time, I also decided that having such a wide neckline for a daytime winter event was just unseemly, and I really ought to fill it in with a pelerine. It was very common in the 1830s and 40s for dresses to be made with a matching pelerine, which is a short cape-like garment that would usually extend to about the shoulders and down to mid-bodice. So I made a little pelerine out of the silk, bag-lined with royal blue cotton. It is made of 3 semi-trapezoidal shaped panels, and the silk panels have piping applied to the neckline and to the hem before I sewed the lining in. It buttons up the front with 5 small ball-shaped silver buttons, and the hem is trimmed with the same vintage lace that I used for the neckline and the short sleeve hems on the bodice. I also paired the dress at the time with a burgundy bonnet and a burgundy sash to make it look a little bit more Christmassy. When all is said and done, I actually have 3 different ways that I can wear this dress just using the main blue silk dress pieces, with short sleeves, with long sleeves, and with or without the pelerine. And this dress made another appearance last fall because when I played Meg in Little Women, which I don't have any pictures of me in this dress, but this was the ball gown that I wore that Marmee was also supposed to have worn when she was Meg's age. For this, I took off the long sleeves and wore it with the open neckline and long ivory gloves before adding the pelerine as I headed out the door. It's nice to have such a versatile piece in my costume closet, especially since it was made so quickly and so inexpensively in the first place. Overall, although this pattern did require quite a bit of modification, I do really like the outcome. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into one of my older costumes. If you have any other questions about this ensemble, please leave them in the comments and I will try to answer them. And please also let me know what other pre-YouTube costumes that you'd like to see me share next in this series. You can find all of those older costumes all over my Instagram and occasionally in some of my videos here, such as the Every Costume I've Ever Made video, which I will link down below. If you liked this video though, please go ahead and click the thumbs up icon. And if you'd like to see more videos like this from me, please go ahead and click subscribe and the little bell icon to be notified every time I post a new video. I do post videos here on YouTube twice a week, with my sewing vlogs out on Tuesdays and other random costuming content like this out on Saturdays, but I post every day over on my Instagram, so please go follow me on Instagram. That's at Lady Rebecca Fashions. And if you'd like to help support all of the work that I do on this channel, I do have a link to my Patreon and my Ko-fi down in the description below. I'd also like to give a special shout out to my Edwardian level patrons, Sharon, Julie, and Mirage. Thank you all so much for joining me today. I hope you all have a wonderful week, and I will see you very soon in my next video. Happy sewing!